Hi, I'm Kristen Chin, and I'm here today to talk to you about the disproval of spontaneous generation. For thousands of years, up until the mid-1800s, spontaneous generation, or the idea that living organisms arise from non-living matter, was widely accepted. It was believed that simple organisms, like salamanders, frogs, worms, insects, etc., came from non-living materials such as mud, dust, and decaying food. For example, as shown to the left, it was believed that leaving dirty underwear or other soiled clothing, wrapped in wheat husks inside an open jar, would lead to the formation of mice in a matter of weeks. This theory potentially predates ancient Greece. Aristotle was the first person to articulate the idea of spontaneous generation. In his writings, he talked about pneuma, a vital heat which he believed was a necessary characteristic of non-living things to give rise to organisms. Additionally, as proof of his theory, he noted several instances in which organisms seemingly appeared out of nowhere, in environments that previously held no life. For example, seeing fish in a newly formed puddle. Francisco Redi was the first person to question spontaneous generation. He was an Italian 17th century physician and poet, and he is credited as both the father of experimental biology and father of modern parasitology. In fact, both of these titles came from his famous meat experiment of 1668. At the time, it was widely believed that maggots spontaneously arose from rotting flesh. However, Redi believed that flies laid eggs on the flesh, and that these flies turned into maggots. To test his hypothesis, Redi placed out 3 pieces of meat to rot. One was left open to the air and to flies, one was completely sealed off, and one was taped over with gauze, which allowed air to go through, but did not allow the flies to contact the meat. The results showed that only the meat that was left open to the air and to the flies had maggots present, suggesting that the meat itself did not lead to the spontaneous formation of them. Unfortunately, these results were not enough to sway the general opinion. Even Redi himself believed that under certain conditions, spontaneous generation was still a valid explanation. And so for many years, there were debates over the validity of the theory of spontaneous generation. Evidence to support this theory came from a man named John Needham, an English clergyman. Even in the mid-1700s, it was known that boiling a solution would kill the microbes that were living in it. Needham wanted to test whether microorganisms would appear following sterilization. So in 1745, he boiled chicken broth and then left the open container to cool to room temperature. After cooling, he sealed the flask. By the end of the experiment, he observed that microorganisms had in fact appeared within the containers. He attributed these results to the air having some sort of vital life force, since he had killed off all of the broth's original microbes. In reality, however, these microorganisms had traveled through the air and into the broth during the cooling process while the flask remained open. Without solid evidence to support the existence of airborne microbes, this experiment was used as support for spontaneous generation. In response to Needham's chicken broth investigation, Lazzaro Spallanzani, an Italian priest, created a counter-argument. He argued that the microorganisms may have appeared in Needham's experiments because they were able to enter the boiled broth through the air in the narrow time frame between when the broth had actually been boiled and when the container had been sealed. In response to Needham's chicken broth investigation, a man named Lazzaro Spallanzani, an Italian priest, created a counter-experiment. He argued that the microorganisms may have appeared in Needham's experiments because they were able to enter the boiled broth through the air in the narrow time frame between when the broth had actually been boiled and when the container had been sealed. In 1768, Spallanzani tested his theory by creating a twist on Needham's experiment. Instead of leaving the flask open and then sealing it later, what Spallanzani did was he sealed the flask from the beginning. He then boiled it, cooled it, and waited, just like Needham did. However, the flask was sealed the entire time. He found that after cooling, no microorganisms appeared in his solution. Now, although these sound like very convincing results, they still were not enough for strong proponents of spontaneous generation. Instead, they argued that Spallanzani had simply proven that air contained the vital life force that Needham had talked about, and that air was a necessary component for the generation of living things from the non-living. Louis Pasteur finally disproved spontaneous generation in 1859 with his famous swan neck flask experiment. This was essentially a combination of both Needham's and Spallanzani's experiments. Pasteur was able to disprove the theory through the use of the swan neck flask. What he did was he heated the neck of a flask until the glass was pliable enough to bend into an S-shaped curve. The unique shape of the flask's neck allowed air to flow freely in and out. However, air particulates, including dust and airborne microorganisms, would settle into the neck of the flask due to gravity. Therefore, they would not be able to reach the solution inside. Pasteur's experiment was very simple. The first step in each of his trials began with boiling broth in the swan neck flask. From there, he had 3 different experimental treatments. The first being that after boiling, the swan neck flask was allowed to sit undisturbed. This resulted in no microbial growth. In the second treatment, the neck was completely removed from the flask so that the flask was open to the air, as well as the airborne molecules that were inside. This did result in microbial growth. Finally, the third treatment involved taking the boiled broth and tilting it so that it came into contact with the trapped microbes in the neck. It was then returned to the flask, and after a period of time, it was also noted that bacteria did grow inside the flask. Essentially, these findings proved that microorganisms are present everywhere, even in the air. They also silenced Spallanzani's skeptics and finally disproved the theory of spontaneous generation once and for all. Redi, Spallanzani, and Pasteur's experiments all worked to discredit spontaneous generation, although Pasteur's work is by far the most recognized. Through this disproval, the law of biogenesis was conversely proven. This states that all life comes from previously existing life, and that, more specifically, that living organisms arise from the reproduction of other organisms. And with that, that is a story of how such a seemingly intuitive idea came to be widely accepted only around a century and a half ago. Thank you for listening. Feel free to leave me any questions below.